Thank you for the introduction. So what I'd like to do this afternoon is talk about feedback and some of the problems with feedback, but encourage us as a community to think differently about what feedback might look like within higher education. And I don't think there is a better group of people than the people assembled in this room to be thinking about this challenge and how we move forwards. So I titled this A Radical Reframing of Feedback. I'm guessing to most people in this room, what I'm going to talk about isn't actually that radical, but in the context of the higher education sector, some of these ideas are pretty radical. So I'm keen to open up dialogue and discussion in this session about where we want feedback to be and how we as a community take that forwards. So I've heard a lot in sessions today about feedback as more than just information, more than just comments. And this represents what David Carlis initially talked about as the old and new paradigm of feedback, and then what David and I took forward in the book that we published in 2019. And we talk about this shift from an old paradigm to a new paradigm. The old paradigm being very much focused on what teachers do, on the provision of comments and information to students. Very heavy focus on delivery of feedback, and coming with that is an emphasis on teachers as having the responsibility for making feedback effective. Students receiving comments rather than having an active role in generating or using those comments, and very much a cognitivist paradigm. Shifting to the new paradigm then, we're thinking about feedback not as that information, but as a process in which learners make sense of that information and use it to inform what they might be doing next. Instead of focusing on the mere delivery of comments, instead we think about the implementation, the uptake of those comments. Students don't simply receive comments in the new paradigm, they generate those. They generate them for each other, they generate them through comparison processes and in a dialogue, and we're talking here much more about a social constructivist perspective. And we argue that the shift there really draws upon design thinking. We need to give feedback prominence in the work that we do in learning and teaching in terms of design. So that's where we're trying to get to, this idea of feedback as more than just information. But I don't think we're getting there yet. And I think there are lots of things that are getting in the way. And I would argue that both research and practice in feedback is absolutely laden with baggage. Baggage that is linguistic and baggage that is conceptual. And it's this baggage which, as a sector, is holding us back from moving away from very well-established, safe approaches to feedback. What I mean then, conceptual baggage, the stereotypical assumptions and the idiosyncrasies that go alongside a concept such as feedback. And there are so many things that accompany what we even understand as feedback that prevent us from doing things and prevent us from moving forwards. And the messages that are sent to students, to teachers about these assumptions are the things that can block us from moving forwards. Linguistic baggage then, this term feedback and the way in which it is used can both enable and hinder progress and development. There's a very well-rehearsed constructivist notion that words create worlds, where the language that we use, the way that something is represented within documentation, actually enables and opens up opportunities for practice to develop in particular ways. But I think it's also important that we recognise that words also create walls, and they block off certain things from being able to happen, and they can hinder development and progress by positioning people and processes in particular ways. So I want to talk about some of these areas of baggage and how we move beyond them, so that we can start to think about a future where feedback is a process and it is something where students play a much stronger role. So I've mentioned the word language, and I've mentioned the definition of feedback, which there's probably several people in this room who are thinking, is she really going to go there? Is she going to open up that box? because I have experienced this topic of the definition of feedback as it's red rag to a bull within the feedback community. I have been in so many conferences and sessions where there have been real arguments about this, and people feel very, very strongly about what feedback is and what it isn't. I'm not going to go there completely, but I am going to touch on some of these issues because I think they're really important in understanding why we may be where we are. So I am not going to argue that we need to change the term and we need to use a different term in some way. I think there's benefit to thinking about feedback in different ways. There's some really interesting research starting to come out about how if we frame feedback as advice, people are more likely to seek and ask for comments if it's framed as advice rather than feedback. And of course coaching, there's a huge literature on coaching and the way in which that approach to feedback might change the way people write comments. But I'm not going to start saying that we need to adopt a completely different term because I think that opens up all sorts of other challenges. And I'm not going to argue that we need to focus unduly on different definitions, but I will touch on some of that. But what I am arguing is that we need to think very, very differently about how we position feedback processes, how we describe them, how we represent them in policy as well as in practice. And that we need to be really aware in a critical sense of the impact of the language that we use and the impact of the way in which feedback is presented and represented within documentation is going to drive practice in certain directions and is going to hinder practice from developing in other directions. So that's what I want to do, and I will come back to baggage in a minute, but first of all I just want to take a slight detour just to touch on some of these issues around definition. So what is and what isn't feedback? These two examples here, when we look at them on the surface, we may say that they are examples of feedback. You've got one here on the left, which was feedback I was given as an undergraduate. Not a lot of feedback there. And then on the right, an example of feedback I've given to a student. I would probably look at that now and say there's probably too much feedback there is the other extreme. But is this feedback? Are these examples of feedback? Now, for many people, this is merely information. This is comments. It's the input into a process. And I think this is encouraging us to think about this statement. What we see here looks like feedback, and certainly for the people who provided it, they thought they were giving feedback, and one of those examples even says a feedback form, so it must be feedback because it's on a piece of paper that says feedback. But does it function as feedback? Does it actually have an impact? Does it change the way that learners think, the way they act, their motivation? And that's the crucial difference for me, is the difference between an input, some comment, a product, but then the broader process. And feedback to me is much more than just the information. But this is a topic that really, as I said, has inspired a lot of debate and discussion. I've got an example here from the blog of Professor Phil Dawson from Cradle, Deakin in Australia, and he wrote a really brilliant blog post after a conference in Helsinki, and as part of a symposium. I was part of this symposium, and there was an argument, there was a proper argument about what feedback is and what it meant. And there were two very different perspectives. One was that feedback was a process. It's more than just the information. Feedback, to be feedback, requires learners to do something with the information, the comments that they receive. Whereas there are others who are saying we don't need that part of the process to be able to call it feedback, because the teacher or the peer who has written comments, at the time they wrote them, believed that this was feedback. We can't say to them you haven't provided feedback, because they believe that they have. And so there's these two polar views, feedback as information, and then the feedback as being much more than that, as being about a process where student action is absolutely essential for something to be called feedback. And I have thought about this far too much since that conference, because I feel this is a really interesting example of why something like feedback means different things to different people, and we need to surface those differences, and we need to explore perhaps ways of meeting in the middle. Now, I don't have the answer to this, but I do have some thoughts, and these aren't particularly well-established thoughts, so really interested to carry on the discussion around this. So some of you may have seen me talk about this picture before. I call this the feedback graveyard. It's an example of feedback that I saw in a UK university one summer when I was visiting, and these student pigeonholes, I don't think these even exist anymore, but at the time they were student pigeonholes with lots and lots of uncollected assessments. Loads of really detailed comments you can see there from teachers, but these comments hadn't even been collected, let alone used. So applying this difference between perceptions and feedback, when the teachers wrote that, they thought they were providing feedback, and there's huge potential in those comments. They can be feedback, they're just not feedback yet. But we can quite clearly see that if the students haven't engaged with that information, how can it be having that real impact? How can it be changing them and their approaches to learning in a way that we could then argue would be feedback? So here's some of my initial thinking about this. So we have ongoing feedback processes. There is no single feedback moment. These things are ongoing and they're complex and interactive. So we have ongoing processes in which there is some kind of input. And that is the generation of some kind of feedback information. It may not come from teachers, it may not even come from peers, it may come from the learner themselves. But some kind of information in relation to something a student has done or thought is generated. At that point, the person who's generated that information believes it's feedback, and it has potential to be feedback. It's a bit like potential energy, that there's something stored in that information that can have an impact. It just hasn't got there yet. And then we have an output. So we have the thing that we're really looking for, that something changes. Students do something with that information and it has some kind of impact. Now those distinctions between is feedback if it's just information, or does a student need to do something with it, really focus on these two parts of the process, the input and the output, without really exploring what goes on in the middle and what happens for information to be transformed into what we might call feedback. So we have this thing in the middle. And what I think is the case is that at that point, what we see there in the pigeonholes, there's a point in time where that both is feedback and yet isn't feedback. It's like Schrodinger's feedback. There's a point in time where it's neither one nor the other. And it's both, because the person providing the information believes that they've provided feedback, yet we haven't had that impact. We haven't had the change or the realisation of the potential of those comments. And so what we're then looking for is what I think of as an activation point. There is a point in time when the potential that is within the feedback information becomes activated. It is a place where it really does then have the potential to influence student learning. And that activation point is where the student thinks about the feedback, does something, changes what they're doing. And that may not be immediately. It could be 2 years down the line when there's a point for the potential impact of those feedback comments to become realised. But we need to help students find that activation point, because that's where we see the impact of feedback coming through. So minor diversion, but coming back to baggage. So what I want to do then now is talk about what I see as 3 examples of linguistic and conceptual baggage that are really affecting our capacity to move forwards in the way we think about feedback. The way in which feedback is often presented in transmission or transactional terms, the peril of metrics, and I will talk about my view of things like the National Student Survey, and then tunnel vision in recognising many different forms of feedback beyond just a feedback form. So those are the 3 examples of baggage that I want to talk through. So starting with this dominance of transactional conceptions of feedback, despite the fact that many of us in this room would disagree with feedback as a process of transmission of information from teacher to student, If we look across the sector at common practices and the way in which feedback is discussed, that is the model that dominates. Feedback is still seen as a product that is passed from a provider to a receiver. And that is a challenge in terms of us moving forward and wanting to position students in a different way. So some of the reasons why this dominates and the problems it creates. So a study I did with Ed Pitt and Rob Nash, where we looked at the ways in which educators thought about their responsibilities in feedback, but also the responsibilities of their students. And one of the questions that we asked them as part of this project was very simply, tell us what you see as your responsibility in the feedback process, and what do you see as your students' responsibility? And what we found was a real dominance of these transactional views of feedback. Most commonly, the participants in our study said, well, it's my responsibility to provide feedback in a timely way, detailed comments, those kinds of things that implied their role was one of feedback giver. And when they talked about the responsibilities of their students, they talked about the students receiving and being open to receiving the information. Not necessarily any more than that, taking action or seeking feedback, but they need to receive the comments. So it's very much that passing, that transaction of giving feedback and then somebody else receiving it. And we found that any representation of student action was quite rare, even when we're talking about sharing responsibility in feedback, something that we do together, rather than it just being the responsibility of teachers. So that's very much in practice. In policy and strategic work, transactional, transmission-focused approaches to feedback still dominate. And this paper, which came out earlier this year, is one of those projects that I wish I'd never started, because it started in one way and it grew and grew and grew. What I did was analysed the learning and teaching strategies and the teaching excellence framework submissions from universities in the UK. And I did various types of analysis and coding of these documents, but one of the things I did was look at it linguistically. As a whole, these documents created a huge data corpus, and it meant that linguistically I could look at how students were positioned within feedback processes within these documents. So if we were to look at verbs where feedback is the object within these documents, do they represent students as being on the receiving end of feedback, or do they represent students as actually being much more active within those processes? So here you can see what I found. This represents the percentage of collocations or instances representing verbs where feedback was the object. I grouped these verbs into three categories. The first was teacher action. So these are give, provide, deliver. The kinds of actions that represent teachers as being primarily driving feedback processes. Then verbs representing student action, I divided into those that represented students as having more of a passive role. So these were the verbs like receive, or even something like open, those kinds of things that imply the role of the student is to somehow just get this information. And then student active, so these were the kinds of verbs that represented students using, applying, analyse, implementing feedback. And what you can see is that across these documents, the teacher actions really dominated very heavily, and where students were described, it was in much more of this passive way that their role was to receive or get feedback. And what I argued here is that if this dominant culture that is represented through policy and strategic artefacts is one where students are positioned very passively, we're not really doing much to promote their engagement. We're not giving them the message that they have a really important role to play. And we're also telling our staff that you have a transmission role within feedback, because policy and strategic documentation really drives practice. It tells us what we need to be doing and what is valued. And so there's a real risk that the representation of students in passive ways within this documentation implies that that is the way feedback processes should operate. So I've talked about practice, I've talked about policy. What about the research literature? So there's another thing that we looked at in recent years was how is the word feedback used within publications on feedback? And we did a similar thing here where we created a large data corpus of publications on feedback in key journals over 2 time periods, 2009 to 2013 and then 2015 to 2019. And we were interested in whether the language had changed. Because if we look conceptually in the literature, there's been a huge shift. We're all talking about different approaches to feedback, and we're all talking about students in very different ways within feedback. But is that represented in the language that we use? So we looked at lots of different linguistic signifiers, nouns modified by feedback, noun modifiers of feedback, and just as in that previous analysis, verbs where feedback is the object. And what we found is that over those 2 time points, there was a shift. There was a decrease in the use of terms such as detailed feedback, teacher feedback, written feedback, and an increase in things like peer feedback and dialogic feedback. So there was evidence of a shift away from the kind of teacher-driven approaches. However, despite that shift over time, when we looked at the most recent papers, there was still a dominance of transmission-focused language around feedback. So there's almost a mismatch between the way in which we're using the term and the concepts that we're trying to describe. And of course this is again a problem, because the way in which we use the term or we represent feedback within the literature will drive practice. We know colleagues look to the research literature to inform what they're doing. So that's another challenge. And it led us to propose a distinction between feedback information and feedback processes. Let's stop using the word feedback on its own, because we don't know whether we're talking about the comments or whether we're talking about something more complex. But could we perhaps reframe that and thinking about feedback information versus feedback processes to distinguish the input, the information, from what happens next? So moving on now to think about metrics, which is another one where I think, should I really go there, because this is incredibly controversial, and it is something that, like it or not, is a very dominant part of higher education, at least in the UK. I think Australia is similar. The student satisfaction is such a core driver of what we do, and I think that has caused us huge problems in assessment and feedback, not least because assessment and feedback is the area where we think we have the most work to do. It's often the one where students report lower levels of satisfaction than other areas. So we tend to think, right, we need to fix it, we need to do something. And I think that the way in which those instruments are framed is driving us to look for answers in the wrong place. So Ed Pitt and I, back in 2017, wrote a piece for Times Higher Education. This was just after the NSS items were reframed. There was a refresh. And we were both really quite demoralised that there was an opportunity that was missed. The wording was tweaked, but the overall message within the items was kept exactly the same. And we argued this was a really crucial time when we could have said, let's change the way in which we evaluate the effectiveness of feedback and send a different message to students about their role within that process. And this then became something that I was interested in, how the language used within metrics might imply particular roles and responsibilities within feedback. And this was a project then that we undertook in a more systematic way, where we gathered national level student satisfaction measures and took the items that related to feedback, and we coded them in various different ways to look at how they position students and how they imply feedback processes should operate. And to preview what we found, they're so transmission oriented, and we argued that creates this tunnel vision of feedback, and it focuses our attention on improving the provision of feedback, which, as many of us in this room would argue, is not the place where we should be focusing our energy. And what that means also is that we position people in particular ways, and if we reframe those items and position students in different ways, perhaps it might help us to drive practice in a way where their participation is much more fundamental. So here's just one example from our findings. We coded them in various different ways, but one of them I'll share with you. We coded them according to the implied role of the student. So the way in which the item was framed, did it suggest that the student had a passive role in feedback, or did it indicate that students had an active role within feedback? And what we found was the vast majority of the items within our data set positioned students as being very passive, and the NSS item from the UK is just a paradigmatic example of this. We still ask them about what they've received, and we ask them about the timing of feedback. And it's saying to them, what your teachers do is the really important thing in feedback, so we're going to ask you to evaluate the effectiveness of that, rather than implying that what really matters in feedback is what they do, and saying we're going to evaluate how you've been supported to be able to do that. And David Bowden and I had already argued this in a book chapter where we said we could send a really powerful message to our students and to our educators about the importance of student agency and feedback by asking them not to rate what they've received, but let's ask them what opportunities have been provided for you, or what opportunities have you sought out to enable you to gather and use the feedback to influence your learning. So we did in this paper make some very tentative recommendations as to how we could reframe the language used within these kinds of items to position students in a very different way. So we asked them about, did you receive timely feedback? Well, very rarely is feedback purely timely for them, because often by the time they've received feedback on one thing, they've moved on to something else. But if we ask them about whether they've received timely feedback, for them timely might be instantaneous, and of course that's often not what we're able to do. But we could ask them about whether the timing of the feedback activities enabled them to act effectively, saying that this is about you and what you are able to do, but we can ask you about what has been provided to help you do that. So I think measurement is a real barrier to moving forwards with feedback processes, because we're required to improve scores on the National Student Survey. It's part of what we do in universities, and I can't see that changing. But what could change is the way in which we actually construct those measures, and we could use them in a way to help us be able to measure what we really value about feedback processes, which is students' engagement, rather than coming to value what it is that we measure, which currently is a very transactional, transmission-oriented approach to feedback. So the third and final area of baggage to explore today is tunnel vision in recognising feedback. And what I mean by this is that we've got ourselves into a situation where the primary form of feedback that is recognised is something that's an official artefact, that feedback is something that happens after an assessment and predominantly maybe written, audio type comments, whereas there are many, many different forms of feedback, and feedback is happening all the time. We don't necessarily recognise all of those different feedback encounters that are taking place. And that's again a problem, because when we ask students to evaluate feedback, they might focus on a very narrow part of the full spectrum of feedback activities that are taking place. And one of the things that we often hear from academic colleagues when they're looking at student evaluations of their courses is they'll say, well, there were loads of feedback opportunities, but they just didn't recognise them. When they were filling out their evaluations, they were thinking about that single piece of feedback maybe they had on an essay or one part of the process. And they often say that they want to be able to just flag up to students all the different parts of the feedback process and all the different opportunities that are available to them. And they said they almost want to have a placard or something. I saw at a conference once, a brilliant presentation, and I looked at the photo and I couldn't find it, of a guy who literally had a t-shirt like this, and he had a shirt with poppers down it over the top, and he would ceremoniously, at a particular point in his lecture, rip open his shirt to reveal this t-shirt, to say to students, now is the point to pay attention. You are receiving feedback at this point in time. It may not look like it because I'm just talking to you and I'm carrying on the dialogue that we've been having, but this conversation that I'm having is feedback, and it will be able to support your learning and your thinking. So what counts as feedback? And I've again heard this conversation come up in this conference here. There's a danger if we broaden this out too far and say everything in learning and teaching counts as feedback, because that's not necessarily the case. But there is certainly a lot more examples of feedback that we don't always recognise as being there. And we're seeing in the literature, I think, our eyes being opened to different approaches to feedback. So David Nichols' work, for example, on inner dialogue and the kind of natural feedback that is generated through comparisons, that's something that hasn't really been part of our ongoing representation of feedback. As I've talked about, in many disciplines, there are approaches to feedback that perhaps don't get recognised, whether that's through coaching or the kinds of practice-based conversations that are happening. So rather than saying this is what feedback is and expanding that out, I think it's up to individual disciplines to really think through what feedback means within their discipline. What is feedback within the professional world in that discipline? And how can we help students to recognise that within their higher education programmes? One of the things then that we can recognise, I think, is the kinds of conversations that take place within taught sessions, timetabled sessions with students that operates as feedback. And some of you may have heard Emma talk about her research in this area. One of the things that we looked at in this study was seminar transcripts across a range of disciplines, and we coded them for instances of feedback where the conversation that was going on within that seminar was feedback and functioned as feedback. And typically what happened was the teacher would ask a question, a student would respond, and what would follow then would be some form of feedback. Lots of different examples of what this was. And actually correcting misunderstandings was much less common than the kinds of feedback that really opens up new learning opportunities for students, that elaborated on their understanding or probed them to go just that little bit further. And this was really rich feedback that was taking place. And so in the paper we argued for a reframing of feedback as part of teaching and learning, and to remove the linguistic boundaries that separate feedback from teaching from learning. There's such a lot of overlap and messiness in the way that those processes work. And that means that we don't have to distinguish what is going on within a learning context that is really fused and really complementary. And it's not just in informal talk sessions. You know, we see this within supervision meetings, or when students drop in to talk in us to office hours or consultation hours. The amount of richness in the feedback dialogue that takes place in one of those sessions, but we don't always capture that as being part of a feedback process. So broadening out our representation, getting away from this tunnel vision of feedback as an artefact, to think about all of the forms of feedback that are going on and helping learners to recognise those. So those are my three examples of baggage. What I want to do to finish then is think about how we might move forwards. And I said I was going to think radically about reframing feedback. Really isn't that radical what I want to talk about. As I said, I'm pretty sure for most of us in this room these ideas aren't new and they aren't radical. But what I think is needed as a sector is some radical changes that require us to let go of safe, well-established and easily measurable ways of thinking about feedback. And there is a lot of risk aversion around this area of practice, again because of the dominance of evaluation and the high stakes that are attached to the way in which feedback operates. And we do need to be quite brave in saying that we don't need to be driven all the time by what we think students will be most satisfied with. Because if we can help them understand that the approaches we might be using are actually going to be hugely beneficial for them and that we've really thought through why we're doing them, there's no reason why they should be dissatisfied with something very different anyway. And I've heard examples at this conference of people talking about things that they tried and saying, well, at first the students really hated it, but they came to love it in the end. And that process is really magic when we can make that happen. But it requires us to help students understand and broaden their perceptions of feedback, as well as us doing the same. So, some ideas then. What if assessment and feedback didn't always have to go together? When we evaluate feedback, when we write policies about feedback, it's always assessment and feedback, as if those are the same thing. When we talk about the National Student Survey, we talk about assessment and feedback. And the problem with this is that feedback is always the poor cousin, the poor relation to assessment. It's the thing that we think about second and assessment first. And David and I wrote about this in a paper where we really put forward the argument that if we want to move forward with feedback, we need to get away from this assessment and feedback must always be together and must always be the same thing. Because there are all sorts of constraints that apply to assessment. We think about the way in which we need to think about quality assurance processes, the steps that an assessment has to go through, the time it takes for us to go through second marking and entering marks into the system, and all these kinds of practical constraints. When assessment and feedback always go together, feedback has to follow the assessment through that chain before we can provide that feedback to students. So we end up being driven by assessment. We often think in design terms as well about assessment. We design our assessments for our programs, and often in our module specifications we have to say what our assessment task will be and how it matches the learning outcomes and so on. But we need to design feedback in exactly the same way and give it as much attention in that process. We also have all sorts of problems with assessment and feedback going together. Anonymous marking is one of them. So there are very good reasons for grading work anonymously. I can't think of any really good reasons for providing feedback anonymously. Yet because those two things are always together, we end up giving feedback anonymously because the grading's been anonymous. Whereas it would be much better if we could have an ipsative dialogue with a student about their progress, which we can't do anonymously. So all sorts of challenges that go together. And we need to reposition feedback as something that is important in its own right. It doesn't always have to go alongside assessment. What if feedback wasn't seen as an artifact? And I think this is a huge challenge that we have, is that we have to document feedback. We have to show that feedback has taken place, not necessarily for any reasons relating to student learning, but relating to quality assurance processes, the accountability around assessment and feedback. And what that can mean is that the comments that we write to students actually end up becoming grade justification rather than developmental information that really supports their progress. And we can have this spectre of the external examiner on our shoulder thinking, oh, they're going to see these comments. So the quality assurance agenda, again, is a challenge, I think, with the way in which it drives feedback processes. We also find then that there can be a risk aversion to people developing new approaches to feedback. So in this study where we conducted about 28 interviews with academic staff across a range of disciplines, we found that there was a real tension between wanting to innovate, but then the fear of the repercussions if something went wrong. And people have been really engaging with the latest literature and had these brilliant creative ideas for what they wanted to do with their assessment, but said, I don't feel I can, because if I have poor module evaluations at the end of the semester, it's going to affect my career development. So again, that's the wrong reason driving practice. It's then not about student learning. That is much much more about the processes and accountability within feedback. And what we argue is we could do quality assurance in a different way. Again, it's like the National Student Survey. We're not going to remove that, and there are really important elements to that. But we could be looking for evidence of something completely different. So for those of you who are familiar with schooling within the UK, we have a very heavy regulation of school level education in the UK with inspections. The Ofsted inspectors will go into schools, they will assess everything from classroom teaching through to leadership. And assessment and feedback has been a really important part of the inspection process. And it used to be that inspectors would spend ages looking through student books at the kinds of comments that teachers had provided to see whether the pupils were getting good feedback. There was a really influential report then that was published about 4 years ago about teacher workload and the amount of time that teachers were writing comments in books without any evidence that anything was actually happening. So what happened was Ofsted shifted to say that rather than looking for evidence of detailed comments in pupils' books, they would look for evidence that the comments had been used. They wanted to see that pupils had had the opportunity to do something with those comments, maybe redraft a paragraph of what they'd written or practice a particular mathematical technique or something. And that really changed practice because it encouraged the teachers to work with pupils for the comments to be useful and for them to be implemented. But why can't we do that in higher education? Why can't we say that a really important part of our enhancement and quality assurance processes relates to student use of feedback? And it repositions and shifts the emphasis in a way that hopefully could drive practice in very positive ways. Lastly, one of the real frustrations that I have with feedback is that we treat it as a commodity, and we treat it as something that is almost subject to logistics management. We have turnaround times. We talk about, in workload models, you've got 20 minutes to mark each piece of work. We outsource feedback, the provision of feedback to for example, GTAs. And it's treated as this commodity, this thing that we can work with in logistics terms, and I think that's problematic. Can we really define the time that feedback takes in terms of minutes? And what kind of message does this send to our academic staff and our students that feedback is something that we can do in a fixed amount of time, that we even should do in a fixed amount of time? And I saw a brilliant tweet recently of somebody saying, I'm given this amount of time to mark a piece of work. I've actually put on the student's essay now, everything I'm doing after this time, I'm doing unpaid, essentially, because what I've been given to do is this. And I think for the students, they must think, why am I university only giving my lecturers this amount of time to provide feedback on my work? But it also, again, gets us back into that narrow way of thinking that feedback is something we write or that we record on an assessment. What about all the feedback that can go on in between and all of those conversations? So I think trying to put a time on feedback is really dangerous. I understand the purpose of workload allocation models and the transparency and fairness around that, but I do think it's really problematic to give a fixed amount of time that often doesn't vary according to the type of assessment or the discipline. Fixed turnaround times, again, this is really like a logistics chain management thing that's come into what should be a really naturally dialogic process. This idea that we need to give feedback in a particular amount of time. There was one quote that really stuck with me from the analysis I did of the TEF submissions and the learning and teaching strategies. One institution talked about in their TEF submission having sector-leading turnaround times. And I thought, gosh, that's just creating an arms race, isn't it, to try and get it shorter and shorter and shorter. And no matter how short that is, it may not be timely in terms of informing students' learning. It could be already too late for the feedback to have any impact. The activation point has been passed. So this fixed turnaround time, I think, is so problematic. Instead, what we need to do is think about how, within any assessment pattern, that feedback can be used. And we need to signpost to students where that might be. And it might not even be that we provide feedback right at the end. It might be that we give students really detailed comments much earlier in the process. And then when it comes to the summative piece, we mark it up against a rubric, but we don't give detailed comments then because they're of no use. The moment has passed. So those fixed turnaround times are really, really challenging. And I also feel, and something I've seen increasingly in my work in higher education, is that the joy of assessment has gone. It's become a task that must be completed. It's a burden for many people because of these constraints and these pressures, when actually the joy of seeing what students have produced and being able to provide them information that will help inform their future learning is a really enjoyable part of the job, at least it should be. Yet assessment as a process and feedback as a process kind of strangles some of that and can turn assessment into something that's more of a burden when we get that big pile of exam scripts on our desk and we've got to work on those. So, what I would like to do is invite this community to think differently about feedback. I certainly don't have the answers, and a lot of what I've talked through today are thoughts and ideas. But I believe that there is, as I said, no better group of people than the people within this room to be coming up with ideas about how we improve feedback into something that is really impactful and enjoyable, rather than something that causes us stress and anxiety. So I'd invite you to think about this. If we want to move feedback forwards and we want to reposition feedback, what are the necessary shifts that we need to see in terms of research, the kinds of designs that we use within our research, the kinds of measures and methods that we use? Policy. What can we do to shift the dominance of some of these forces within policy that influence what we do? And in terms of practice, how can we reward and facilitate innovation within assessment and feedback and enable people to have more control over what they do in their own courses or units? So I'm going to leave it there. I'd just like to thank the funders of the research and also the research assistants who've supported some of the work that I talked about today.